Hi, everybody. Um, we are waiting for Chris Johns to join. There's some issue at his end. I don't quite know what is happening. And he has just tried on three different devices and he can see nothing for some reason. So I'm just going to send him a quick email. Apologies for this. You can certainly write messages or anything else you please in the text box at the bottom, and let's see what happens from there. So there are people joining us. I actually don't know where you're all joining from. So if anybody is willing to tell us where you're from, that would be great. The purpose of this evening was just to get used to live casts, which I've never done before. And what I wanted to do was to talk about this amazing and interesting new book by Dan Davies, The Unaccountability Machine. And it's got the lovely subtitle of Why Big Systems Make Terrible Decisions and How the World Lost Its Mind. What I highly recommend you do is go and buy this book. It's a very interesting, challenging, and unusual book. And I've made lots of notes on the book the whole way through. I think if I was to summarize the book in any sort of a way, it would be we've all had the experience of being told that our call is very important to the chatbot or other entity that's listening to us on the end of the line, and that we can expect to have a customer representative in about 4.5 hours' time. And at that point, you want to scream, throw your phone out the window, and you find that you can't get any further than this. And that is a classic accountability sink. There's no one in charge, there's no one you can get in touch with, and there's nobody that can put the problem that you've got right in any meaningful way. So I wrote some notes on the book, and I'm just going to summarize a few of them. The first thing to say is this is a really interesting book. There's lots and lots to learn. One of the things that you'll discover is the arbitrariness of the rules with which we have ended up living our lives and the capriciousness with which they've originated from. The so-called 2% rule that's used by central banks as the rate of our target rate for inflation, essentially a finger in the air a number of years ago. There's no good empirical justification for it, as opposed to 1.75% or 2.25% or any other number that you care to choose. Similarly, the debt break that we've tied ourselves into knots with in the EU of maintaining government deficits of 3% or less. Again, entirely arbitrary. The origins of this are disinterred by Dan Davies, and it becomes surprising at how a number, when it's invented or it's posited in some way, that somebody will glom onto that, and then it becomes the thing that we actually have to buy and we have to stick to. So coming back to the book, it fizzes in all sorts of ways. It goes in a bunch of different directions at once. And I think that's a strength rather than a weakness. I think deep down, it expresses a deep, deep discontent with the bag of tools and ideas that people are using to navigate the world that we're currently living in. The ideas that happen to be lying around are the ones that are grabbed up, and those are the ones that are used. when rather than us going through the difficult job of thinking new thoughts because the situations that we might find ourselves responding to are so new. So this book is very impressive in many ways. It's written by an economist, and he takes some huge pops at economics through this book. It would possibly be correct to say that he's actually a disenchanted economist, somebody who takes the view that actually economics has gone very badly wrong because it's into building models rather than spending a lot of time actually working in the empirical world and looking for the goodness of fit of those models to what happens in the world. And Davies makes the remarkable point that economists aren't good at reading balance sheets. Hence the massive problem that we had with the great financial crash a number of years ago, where there were massive amounts was massive amounts of debt accumulated on balance sheets of banks and banking like entities, which sank the world economy in the late zeros, just at the point at which people were claiming that we were in a period of the great moderation and all our financial problems had been solved. There's many other things that I would say about this book. One of the things that if I'm to try and put it in a variety of different terms, it's an exploration of how economics has gone wrong. It introduces a mode of thinking which is a little unusual, which is to say that Davies encourages us to think about feedback and feedback loops in ways that we're not used to generally thinking about when we look at the great organizations and institutions of our societies. And in particular, he makes the strong case that what we should be doing is attempting to bring back cybernetic means and ways of thinking as a way of isolating who is to blame when something goes wrong. And this comes back to the phenomenon that I've mentioned already. This your call is important to us. This call is valuable to us in all sorts of ways. Another thing that's really worth thinking about is the issue of how perverse incentives drive outcomes. And there's a startling and really quite appalling story in the chapter entitled Something's Up. And this is a story that I was unaware of, but it's how the management at Schiphol Airport managed to create a system which resulted in them, and I jest you not when I say this, shredding 440 ground squirrels because they just didn't know what else to do with them. Really quite appalling consequence. And it was because the rule set said that we must get rid of the particular group, or we must manage biohazards, and they had never thought about what other feasible alternatives might be when the environment presented a problem that it was very difficult for the rule set that they had been provided with to cope with. In other words, if you think about the rule set that the institution provided, nobody was accountable for it. Everybody was mortified when these poor squirrels were pushed through a shredder, and only in the weeks and months afterwards did it come to be clear to be the case that nobody had thought about the ethics of I see Deirdre Mooney asks, did they kill them first? I don't think that's clear, Deirdre. I don't believe they did. One would have hoped that they had gassed them or done something humane before shredding them. But of course, if they had simply gassed them, they could have disposed of their bodies in some other way. So everybody behaved correctly. They behaved according to the rule set that was provided, and yet they did something terrible. And Davies says, What went wrong? Well, we know they set up a decision where animals with the wrong import paperwork were left to somebody in the agricultural department. And the problem is who was responsible. Somebody who's very, very distant from the uh, application of the rule set uh, was not involved. And it ended up being the case that nobody actually was responsible. In other words, as Davies puts it, a decision with no owner had been created because it was the outcome of a process. And this process worked well until something that hadn't been anticipated showed up, and then it delivered disastrous results. And we know this happens time upon time upon time again. We've seen many, many examples of how this has happened in other parts of the world. We've seen it in the mess that the financial system got itself into some 15 or so years ago, and the consequences of that, which we're still living with. I think there's a fundamental line in this book which I've turned over in my mind many, many times. And it's in a section headed Accountability and its Discontents. There are a number of reasons why people might construct accountability sinks. And this book, of course, is very humorous and funny in all sorts of ways. The most fundamental one is that being held accountable for things is horrible. The key privilege of being a manager surely ought to be that you have the status of being a manager rather than being one of the managed. And that is the perfect encapsulation of the problem where an accountability sink is concerned. You create a system that others are responsible for actually implementing. And when that system goes wrong, you're nowhere to be found. Sam Bowden hopes that the shredder would be instantaneous. I have no idea what the design of the shredder is, and I'm sure if we went online, we could find something out. It appears to be the kind of shredder that's used to kill young male chicks. So it may actually not have been the right size for killing these poor squirrels. So anyway, there's lots more in this book that I could pick out, but the key point really is that when it comes down to it, when we focus on trying to understand how crises occur, we have a really, really big problem. We simply don't understand how the black box that comprises our organizations, our states, and other. And if it's a very, very complex system, Davies makes the very counterintuitive, to my mind, remark that actually we shouldn't bother trying to understand how it works internally at all. What we really need to do is try and understand its inputs and try and understand its outputs and figure out how to work the thing from there. I've mentioned on a number of occasions that Davies seems to be a very disenchanted economist. He's got a beautiful line where he says that economists spend lots of time proving things in the model and then acting as if they are there in the world. And this is something that economists do all the time. And coming back to the issue of accountability, he has another lovely line. Just as accountability is psychologically intolerable to the decision maker, its absence is intolerable to the subjects of their decisions. So we're in, and I see Tull McAdoo says that they were hand-fed into the shredder, just like the Anglo-Irish documents. And of course, Anglo-Irish is another great example of a box that, or a black box that we didn't understand had gone terribly wrong. The regulator who is mentioned here, Colin McCarthy, gets a shout out towards the end of the book for his comments on our regulator at the time, and his remarks on the regulator are hilarious, but nonetheless very, very serious. So let me just see if there's any questions here that I can actually point to. We can trace all of history's recent awfulness back to the crash. And indeed, this is something that Davies doesn't shrink from. He actually points to the crash and the consequences of that crash as being at the core of many of the great problems that we're suffering from. And he makes the comment, and I think what Tull has actually commented on really makes sense in this point. The common thread between MAGA, Brexit, the Five Star Movement, Hindu Tava, and all the rest, the populist movements of the 2010s promised a simpler world. They were taking on the great anxiety of their people and addressing it. They were promising to restore the broken communication channels, to make voices heard, to force the managerial class to listen. And in the next killer line, the same analysis tells us they're fake solutions. You can't reverse the direction of time. And I think, again, there are so many lines and other things in this book that I think are really, really fabulous. Chris has actually, I'm sorry, I don't understand what has happened in terms of Chris being able to join us. But he, in the email beforehand, commented that he's read the book twice. I've made so many remarks on the book that actually it's a book that I will want to go back to again, because I think, details apart, it's actually a source of really quite some enduring wisdom and explanation regarding many of the elements of the world that we find ourselves in. Now, I do have a few beefs with the book, and that's entirely natural, but I don't want those beefs to offset what I think is really the overall signal importance of this book. It's one, and John Lee actually makes the interesting remark, studying inputs and outputs still seems vulnerable to outlying events. And actually, this is something that Davies addresses in the book, and that's to do with the variance in the environment and how we underestimate the variance in the environment. The way the models that we use of the world inevitably are much less complex than the world itself, because a model is just a model. Although there is the old joke that some models are that all models are wrong, but some models are useful, which I think is maybe a useful thing to mention here. Now, the book travels in a whole variety of different directions. You'll be surprised to find that you are in Salvatore Allende's Chile. I was unaware that the founder of, or one of the founders of Cybernetics, Stafford Beer, had been advising Allende back in the early 1970s. And the book takes a swing in a different direction and examines closely Milton Friedman's documents and writings on the duties that managers owe companies, and that the purpose of a company is to maximize shareholder value. And Friedman's worldview is absolutely filleted in this book by Davies. And he actually points to the reality of how shareholder value is something that is impossible to define, although it sounds plausible on the face of it. As I was reading this chapter, it actually occurred to me that there's a real problem when you're thinking about shareholder value. How do you maximize shareholder value for those who are short and long your shares? You have predators who want to dump the company and have gone short on your company, and you've those who might be of the Warren Buffett school, take a stake and want to hold on to it forever. You can't maximize shareholder value in both of those situations. That's a practical impossibility. It's something that just conceptually makes no sense whatsoever. So anyway, there's lots more, and Davies is refreshingly blunt in the way he approaches these questions. And he says straight out, this is what makes the Friedman doctrine, as far as I can see, a lie. It's an exhortation to executives to reverse the truth. They are meant to ignore the reality of the company and act as if they are directly employed by human beings, but then ignore the reality of human beings and act as if they are employed by a theoretical construct. So there's lots more, as I've said, it's I think a book that makes lots of cases for doing things in a variety of different ways, and they all kind of converge in this final chapter, which has the lovely title of "What is to be done," which of course is a slogan from a whole variety of other places. Um, so what does he have to say? Well, there's a lot of wisdom in this final chapter. You're going to end up having a digression via Brian Eno, which to me was very, very surprising, and he resurrects a name that has been, I think, often forgotten in economics, and that's John Kenneth Galbraith. And Galbraith stood for an unusual approach to economics, which is a narrative and case-based approach rather than a mathematical modeling approach. And he remarks at several points that Galbraith offered a way of viewing corporations and companies that got lost in, quote, the mathematical revolution. And he also mentions a hero of mine, Herbert Simon, was the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize. He won it in economics back in the 1980s, because he proposed a way of focusing on the activities of firms, which focus very, very firmly on the behavior of the firms themselves. And he reverses the idea that, or walks away from the idea that profits are not the goal to be maximized, but they're simply a constraint. Managers do enough to keep investors happy and then spend the rest of their time and effort trying to do new things they could be proud of. And Simon, of course, had the theory of satisficing, which was a combination or one of these portmanteau words where he suggests that basically we're not trying to optimize, we're not trying to maximize. What we're trying to do is enough to get by in the moment that we find ourselves in. He also then takes a real pop at the idea of limited liability as an accountability sink. The reasons that it might have been entered into or invented as a means of running companies are all perfectly reasonable. But if you're a private equity investor, the point, of course, is that it allows them to take on debt, extract the cash and the knowledge that if things go badly, this information can't travel upstream to affect the entity that took the decision. And my guess is that he's nodding to some of the consequences of privatizations in the UK, where private equity investors seem to have run amok in certain cases and have left entities with large quantities of debt. And the feedback loop that he provides is a really interesting one. That if you take control of an operating company, you have to guarantee its debts. You just can't take debt on, extract the debt, and then walk away, which I think is a really remarkable way of thinking about a feedback loop. That you actually then aren't maximizing shareholder value. What you're doing is thinking about ways of behaving so that the entity that you're managing actually survives through time. A really, really curious and very, very different way of thinking about how companies should be run. Now, he again in a bunch of places disavows economists, and he says he's got two axioms towards the end. One where he says every decision-making system set up as a maximizer needs to have a higher level system watching over it. And that in turn implies a definite conclusion for the design of real-world systems. You can't have the economists in charge. not in the way they currently are, which I think is a really cruel remark about his own uh, profession. Now, this book was clearly in the writing for a couple of years, and there's not much about behavioral economics or the behavioral economics revolution in this book at all. There's a tiny bit of neuroscience, which is not right. I regret to say he talks about the cerebrate cats, and I regret to say the anatomy is entirely wrong. These cats did not have their cerebellums removed. They, in fact, had their cerebral cortices removed with interesting consequences for them. And he also, towards the end, has a note where he says, at the time of writing, ChatGPT has come along. But that might have changed by the time you read this. And if the events of the past week are anything to go by, well, that might be the case, because DeepSeek, I think it's called, apparently can run a ChatGPT equivalent on your desktop computer. So at a fraction of the cost of the running of ChatGPT. He also makes some other interesting comments that I think could have been amplified a little bit further, which is to talk about modern artificial intelligence systems, in particular, so-called recurrent neural nets. Now, a recurrent neural net is just a feedback system. It does something and it takes an input. You do this thing, you get a reward. You do that thing, you get pain. It's a feedback loop, and these are other ways of ensuring that companies. And Tull tells me DeepSeek was hacked this afternoon, which is quite remarkable. So we'll have to see where that story goes. But he actually pushes a point here, which remarkably, clearly great minds think alike. He talks about the possible use of ChatGPT and similar kinds of systems as a means for facilitating decision making. And over the past few, or maybe the past month or two, a paper appeared in the journal Science, which you may or may not be aware of. It's the premier, one of the premier journals in science more generally, and it is a paper on something called Habermas machines, named after Habermas, the German philosopher. And what Davies wonders is, can we put these devices as entities that can be used, or can we use ChatGPT or similar kinds of entities as a means of mediation and engaging in two-way communication between a very large audience and a smaller decision-making system. That might be you or us more generally trying to make sense of communication with our broadband provider, or whatever it happens to be. And this fantastic paper on the so-called Habermas machines took used LLMs to find common ground between people who are of very, very different political persuasions with respect to a particular questions. And they chose Brexit, which of course is a matter of great concern to people who are living in the UK. And they showed that, at least in certain iterations, that common ground can be found between people who are apparently of very, very different political persuasions. Although he uses the interesting metaphor of bringing Shakespeare, Machiavelli, and Napoleon and getting them to design our tax forms. Maybe that's reasonable. I don't know, but the point is that this book is fizzing with all sorts of interesting ideas, and I'll hold the cover up again just so people can see it. It's the Unaccountability Machine by Dan Davies. I think it's going to be coming out in the US very soon, and I think it's coming out in paperback very soon. I bought this as a hardback, having read some of the early reviews of it. Uh, it. So, in sum, what would I say? This book is an important book. It's one that will repay reading again. It's got lots of things to say about the state of the world that we find ourselves in, that we're subject to the whims of large entities that don't allow us to hold them properly accountable. And because they're monopolies in many cases, the price mechanism is not something that will allow us to hold them responsible. So the danger of bankruptcy is not something that they need to worry about. And we saw that, of course, during the great financial crash. Um, Central banks and governments decided to save institutions. They were too big to fail and not save people. So we've ended up with 15 years of difficulty as a result of that. I wonder, just to put it out there, Tull has clarified that it was cyber attacked rather than hacked. Are there any questions on this or kind of related topics that people would like to tap into the message box? I'll take a short drink here. So, okay, well, I think after 35 minutes, I regret again. I hope Chris is out there somewhere in cyberspace. And again, if we listen to this book, we shouldn't be talking about cyberspace. We should be talking about cybernet space. The word is butchered compared to the way it should have been. And I hope to be able to do this again next or some other time soon. It's actually been enjoyable to talk about a book. Um, but I do regret that we did not get to have the back and forth that I had hoped. Oh, now how about this? Tull just says billions were wiped off tech stocks tonight because of the DeepSeek attack. So I'm very glad that I'm not invested in any tech stocks. I guess there's a larger issue. There's a few interesting developments in the kind of LLM AI space over the last while. Um, Desktop AIs of various sorts are becoming available, and the computing power that's required to run these systems is much less than it would appear to have been. When you look at ChatGPT, even a couple of months ago. And I wonder, does that mean that the so-called 500 billion that will be, or that Sam Altman has been talking about, will actually end up being invested in this new AI infrastructure? And John Lee, I'm hoping John is a former student of ours. I'm guessing he is. They released a new multimodal model today, which will be exciting to see. Agreed, smaller and better models is exciting. Oh my God, Deirdre Mooney has just said the wiping of 588 billion from NVIDIA alone. And John is indeed one of our former students. So it's great that you've joined us, John. Okay, folks, that's 37 minutes. I had hoped that Chris would have joined us, and for some reason that seems not to have happened. I think we're going to have another go at trying to get Chris to do this with us, and maybe we could have another look at this book from the point of view of somebody who is actually an economist. Chris was formerly the chief economist with the Bank of Ireland, and his blog, At the Other Hand, which you'll find on Substack, is very, very good. And the podcast that he does with Jim Power is fantastic. Matt C comments, I have even managed to run a small but decent model on my Android phone. The technology is fascinating. Indeed, it is. Now, let me just say something about ChatGPT. Uh, it's not sentient. It's not Uh, uh, it's not Skynet. It's not going to take over the world. But I think it's impressive in all sorts of ways that are very helpful if we stop pretending it knows things about the world. So, for example, today I was able to get it to generate a script that allowed me to create a synthetic data set in Excel. Uh, Now, I could have tried to write that script myself. It would have taken me all day, not a good use of my time, but it was able to do it. It was able to give me the appropriate script to put into Excel. It generated the synthetic data set really, really well. And there's all sorts of I think augmentation uses for tools like ChatGPT that will make us much more efficient uh, in our everyday lives. The the huge claims about uh, artificial general intelligence and all the other things aside, I think these tools will be turn out to be useful in all sorts of remarkable ways. Deirdre comments, such a shame Chris could not make it. Um, and Claude Sonnet is the better coder, though. Oh, okay. Maybe I should be using Claude for generating the scripts. And indeed, Deirdre is correct. It's all about knowing what to ask it. And I found with ChatGPT, if you're using it, tell it to take a moment to consider things that you don't need to go at it straight away. I tried DeepSeek using the exact same prompts that I used in ChatGPT for something yesterday. And I have to say, I thought ChatGPT was better than DeepSeek. I might change my mind on that, but at the moment, my sense was that ChatGPT, at least for the limited prompts that I used, is seems to be somewhat better. What has surprised me in respect of some of the other systems, if we take Google's Gemini for a moment, they don't seem to have connected Google Scholar to it. So they've got the scientific literature indexed, and they haven't done anything useful in terms of getting that attached to it. And I had great difficulty with Gemini last week, and it really gave answers to questions that if it had been exploring the connection to the scientific literature properly, that would have been much better. Um, Pete Ruse has made a comment about, I don't know anything about this, that AI systems are about to be used to decrease spending on disabled people in the UK. That sounds appalling, but I don't live in the UK, so I don't know any of the details of that. But it certainly doesn't sound good. Anders comments, I got the link only after 30 minutes. So my guess there is that there are some glitches still in this live cast, which doesn't really seem for some reason it hasn't worked in terms of getting Chris online, which I'm disappointed about. Deirdre comments, such a shame Chris could not make it. The Economist cynical viewpoint would be entertaining. And indeed, listening to and reading some of the things that Chris and Jim have to say about economics makes me glad that I didn't pursue economics as a career, because I actually studied it for a year in college and decided that it was not for me. John also comments that he struggled with the link as well and didn't know it was only in the app. And there was no link in the invite. So there's a few glitches with this system. I can't help you with those, but what I will do is feedback the points that I can to Substack itself and see if they can do something about this. But it's yeah, I guess it's early days yet. Maybe the cyber attack on DeepSeek has actually been responsible for this. Okay, folks, unless there are any Other questions? I'm going to sign off because that's about 45 minutes. And thank you very much for bringing yourself along and spending some time with me. I'll just hold up the title again. I really do recommend this book. Tim Harford's comments across the top are correct. It is funny, fascinating, and compelling. It is true that big systems make terrible decisions. Don't be a ground squirrel in Schiphol Airport, is what I would say. And Deirdre has a pointed remark, as most professors will say, could do better. So thank you all for that. And hopefully we will do this again soon. I've been thinking there's been some really interesting papers on preventing dementia, to change topics entirely, but this is a topic very close to my heart that I may talk about because we now know perhaps 40, maybe even 45% of cases of dementia can be changed by changing your behavior. In other words, the things that you do. So I think that might be an interesting topic to do a live cast on at a future point. Okay, thank you all, and I'm going to stop there.